Yeah, so let's just start with a little bit of background. And this is not only our opinion. This is kind of the situation that we see in the market as I speak, that amidst the entire like environmental consequences of mismanaged plastic waste, we see a lot of movement on the consumer side, but also increasingly on the private sector and regulator side who want to act on plastic pollution. And what has really changed in the last couple of years is that the transparency and availability of information that is often based on scientific studies regarding the impacts of plastic pollution has made it to the forefront of the newspapers and different types of boardroom discussions, which created a lot of different interests within organizations, but also a need to act on the consumer and like the behavior of individuals that has changed as a consequence of increased understanding of the consequences of mismanaged plastic waste. And it's not only the consumers that are actively trying to act on their own behavior by reducing plastic waste wherever they can, for instance, like establishing different types of reuse models that they would like to pursue, or being more actively involved in bringing their own bags when they go shopping, up to the point where they think about engaging with different nonprofits or like cleanup organizations to clean up the planet. It also goes to regulators who are increasingly imposing new different types of extended producer responsibility schemes, but also plastic taxes, which we've seen in the European Union specifically, plus the United Kingdom, where new taxes have been imposed, all with the major aim to put a price tag on plastic waste that is created. Now, just as a quick disclaimer for all the people in the room, I'm not like using the word plastic to shame the plastic industry or like put any sort of like negative, impacts on the word itself, because of course plastics are a really great group of material that is essential for a lot of applications. So by no means, I think we advocate for like a complete kind of out design of the material group, but much more we want to help the industry and our economy and planet and species as a whole to make sure that we can keep plastics in the loop and we can create a circular economy for plastics, but also other types of materials that corporate actors are working with. So in terms of the intents that companies have developed over the last few years regarding plastic stewardship or the responsible management of plastics, if you want, it is really similar to what we've seen in the carbon space, where actors have followed up on the greenhouse gas protocol and the Paris Agreement in 2015 to develop strategies that are holistic and yet very kind of specific to an individual company, because a lot of the actors feel really strong about making sure that the impacts that they create are really specific to their own company, and they see like why they are potentially contributing to reducing like the energy consumption in one way, or like reducing the different types of materials that are used in another way. So in a nutshell, there are like 3 stages that we've seen companies typically go through. Here, this example is like specific to consumer packaged goods companies, but it's like also true for other organizations. For instance, we've seen Bentley as a automotive company take actions on reducing their plastic waste and such. But typically, the process steps are like threefold. First, companies try to measure their footprint or to understand in what different processes and what different applications of their business plastics or the materials are used. Second, based on this baseline analysis, they try to understand where there is an opportunity to take environmental action, which typically follows the waste management hierarchy, starting with opportunities to kind of reduce, then to reuse and optimize, and lastly also to recycle and engage for better recycling systems, and like look at this entire spectrum as a solution set and not necessarily as a sort of silver bullet approach to make sure that plastic pollution can be addressed. And lastly, because like all of us who are on the call today and also other types of stakeholders, including regulators, policymakers, investors, suppliers, distributors, are potentially interested in measuring the performance of an individual actor, there's also a massive need to track and report a company's progress. And these are the specific areas where we are active in as Ampliphi. So we've developed a software that helps companies to recycle their internal product packaging and operational data to then identify the different types of footprint hotspots to make sure that these insights can be used for data-driven reduction strategies. And lastly, we help them with the automation of reportings so that this information can be shared with voluntary frameworks such as the Ellen MacArthur's Global Commitment, but also, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative and different types of mandatory reportings. But as I mentioned initially, the goal of this presentation is not to promote us as an organization, but to much more tell you about the collaborative work that we have pursued with the fellow members of the Prevent Waste Alliance. And when we became a member of the Prevent Waste Alliance, like about a year ago, it was really important to us to use the network to like kind of harness the power of different individuals and different organizations. So really the diversity of the network so that we can work towards more harmonization in the initial step of this, let's say, plastic stewardship journey, if you may. And to really kind of harmonize the approaches that we all take, or companies or actors take, when measuring a footprint or like trying to understand what sort of like plastic waste has to be disclosed. We first framed like the kind of vision that we have and like the tool that we will want to use for this. And our like vision that we came up with was really to make sure that we can help decision makers in different settings to access all the relevant information they need to accelerate the circular economy for plastics. And we had a lot of like discussions in the beginning of the sub-working group that we created together with the Prevent team, sitting under the plastic working group that Prevent has, and then eventually concluded that it would be great that we could organize different sessions and to have discussions with the members before we eventually try to synthesize or like summarize all the insights in one discussion paper. The discussion paper is the really kind of like, well, it's a document that you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. It exists in a PDF form, and I'm sure will be shared as a follow-up to this call. And this should be the major focus of this session today, where we would love to tell you a little bit more about the, let's say, frameworks that we have analyzed as part of the discussion paper, and then also the different recommendations and insights that we have gathered from this work. So before we dive deep into the discussion paper, there was like a really interesting discussion that came up in the beginning of the sub-working group, mainly because we had a few actors from the plastic industry involved. And they made the really fair point that the entire like measurement around like plastics or like identifying the use of the material should not have a strong negative connotation, because it can also come like organizations and actors can also pursue like different improvements that they can make along the lines of using plastics. And that's why we decided to kind of like split or like specify the two different streams that can go into measuring plastics, which are like related to footprinting, where we try to quantify the sort of negative externalities, negative impact that can be associated with a company regarding plastic pollution, but then also the handprint or kind of the positive actions that a brand takes compared to a status quo to improve their use of materials and also potentially accelerate the circular economy. So that's just the context, but for the discussion paper, we mainly focused on the footprinting side of things with a few methodologies that are also active on the handprinting side. And these are like some considerable differences that I will be happy to talk more about as we deep dive into the frameworks. So before we go into the individual frameworks, I wanted to give you this high-level overview that is more than open for debate. If you would like to sort of like criticize or suggest that some of the positioning on the left-hand side is not similar in your opinion. But basically, what we have identified is that there are a few frameworks that have been around for a pretty long time, and they are majorly different by the scope. So it's all about saying, okay, what is the level of granularity that the framework takes, where we have the Global Reporting Initiative, for instance, providing a framework for sustainability disclosures, which is very generic, and it captures information around the environmental, but also the social and the governance performance. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have like niche frameworks that include, for instance, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Commitment Progress Report, and then also, for instance, the Qantas and EA's Plastic Leak Project, which is ending up in nature. And the kind of the other side of the spectrum is really like how like broadly these frameworks are used. And also here we see quite a substantial difference, where we have, for instance, the Resource Plastic Footprint Tracker developed by the World Wildlife Fund, which is a really kind of great framework, I think, for plastic waste disclosure specifically, but is I think just gaining ground in terms of acceptance and also harmonization with the existing landscape. So in a nutshell, we analyzed these 5 frameworks, and we tried to kind of break them down by the kind of components that are like relevant, that make them special. And then based on that, we try to identify the differences between the individual frameworks. So as I mentioned, all this information is available in quite a more comprehensive format as part of the discussion paper. But I just try to be like a bit, let's say, more high level when I go through these frameworks, and would love to kind of go into more details if you know, the interest comes up in the discussion or the Q&A. So as the people on the call who are kind of more actively involved in disclosure frameworks may know, is that the initial scope or the approach or the vision that disclosure frameworks defines can be very like different depending on what we look at. So like whereas a few frameworks, such as, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative, as I mentioned, has a very broad focus on sustainability disclosures, and mainly looks at the sort of like footprint side of things. So really trying to measure how a company is doing on the metrics that quantify like negative impacts. We have frameworks like the Ellen MacArthur Global Commitments Progress Report, where like a few metrics are captured which are related to the actual improvements that companies make. So for instance, one number or like one KPI that is tracked is the percentage of, let's say, reusable packaging in the context of packaging. And there, like the framework provides a format to make sure that companies can track how they are in line with the targets that were set by the Ellen MacArthur's global commitment, which were to, you know, have like X% of reusable packaging by 2025 and such. And to understand where a company stands over time, there's obviously a need to, you know, kind of measure where is this going. Sorry, I see there's a bit of an echo, so if you may mute yourself, that would be helpful. Thanks. Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. Cool. Yeah, so that was the first bit, like basically to say, well, okay, the approach is different. Then in the second phase, the measurement boundaries can also like widely differ from each other, because depending on like what we look at, some frameworks are literally focusing on the primary packaging only and try to first get an understanding of the quantities of, let's say, plastics that are used by an organization in the primary packaging applications. An example for this is, for instance, the like Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Commitment, where a lot of the focus is on packaging. But then the 3R initiative and the guidelines for corporates, which were developed and published in 2021, provide like a sort of insight on how the company basically includes like uses of plastics that go beyond the primary packaging to, for instance, also include, you know, secondary packaging, tertiary packaging. Microplastics is another component that is like considered by the 3R, but like neglected by other organizations. And of course, depending on the intent for you to like quantify your footprint and the area of business you're in, microplastic pollution can, of course, be a substantial risk and substantial component in your plastic-related footprint. So the measurement boundaries are one thing that we have identified as a difference. And then The third point is the disclosure mechanism, where we see a few like differences in these frameworks. So, for instance, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Commitment, they have a kind of like online dashboard that is available for like public use, where you can really track and identify the progress that companies are making. Of course, this is upon the company to decide whether all of these components will be disclosed. We have a few, or there are a few organizations that disclose all of their details, and others or that are really kind of high level and don't publicly disclose some of the metrics. But then on the other side, we have like methodologies or frameworks like the Plastic Leak project, again, which is like typically used for more like internal modeling, and they don't have a specific disclosure mechanism that asks companies to kind of publicly disclose some of this information. And then lastly, the strategic integration potential is another point that we discussed, and that's mainly kind of considered in the context of integrating the measurement side of things into like more holistic strategy building, where some of the frameworks provide like very kind of on-hand assistance with the implementation of improvements and different types of services, but others are really just here to provide the service as a provide the kind of measurement as a service, and to stop there. And of course, it is relevant from a company's point of view specifically, which is the major scope of this discussion, to focus on a methodology or like a framework that can be used in many different applications and ideally works for other types of materials. So not only plastics, but also potentially even for like a broader circular economy scope, to develop a strategy that is holistic and really goes beyond the niche focus on one material. So these are kind of the high level, like, let's say, differences that we have identified between the different frameworks. And I would now love to just go into a little bit more detail, talk a bit about the frameworks. I see that it's already kind of 25 past 1 in Central European time. So yeah, try to be short or quick with that, and potentially only just skim through it. But then we have some more time in the discussion to really deep dive into these points. One additional disclaimer that I just want to make, in case that we have people or representatives from some of the organizations who are referred to on this call, please take your chance to kind of correct me if I said any things that you don't agree with, or to provide more in-depth sort of insights into your methodologies, because I think it would be great for the participants of this call to also hear from other people how they develop their frameworks and what their visions are, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I think that I'm just going to be like very high level on these 5 methodologies, because then we have a bit more time for the Q&A and the discussion. So the first one, the 3RI corporate guidelines, were like published in 2021, as I mentioned, as a kind of collaborative effort between different like large members of the community, including a few of the Prevent members, like BV Rio, Danone, Nestle, and Veolia. And the thing that really kind of makes them stand out is that it was developed in context with the Veros plastic program, which is all about kind of like simplifying the financing of plastic collection and plastic recycling activities. And the corporate guidelines were really published in tandem to this new standard for impact investments, or plastic credits, if you may want to call them like this, which was really to kind of provide a contextual setting for companies to kind of like know how they can establish their footprint and then also act upon it, which includes internal reductions of their plastic related footprint, but then also potentially the financing of additional plastic collection and plastic recycling infrastructure. So that's the bit on this framework. The Resource Footprint Tracker is a development by the World Wildlife Fund in the United States specifically, and it has been used by the American Plastic Pact reporting. I think their approach is really interesting because it provides like a really in-depth framework, allowing a breakdown of the different product levels. And we are also using the framework kind of context for the assessments that we support, together with like all the other 5 frameworks. Yeah, plastic leak project. I think it's a little bit unfair and a little bit inappropriate to like fully compare this framework with like the others, because it is more of a methodology to model how we can determine leakage. Stefan will tell you a bit more about the data that is used there and the way how these frameworks work. But we still included it because we thought that it is important to also identify how, if companies should kind of stop measuring their plastic related disclosures at the gate, so to speak, or if they should go beyond that and also try to understand the destinies of the materials that they put on the market by trying to quantify what the recycling rates are in their sales regions, but also the potential rates of mismanaged waste, which can be used as a synonym for plastic leakage. So the fourth one is the global commitment of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where I think the reporting framework or the disclosure mechanism really stands out, because this is a really cool dashboard that is pretty interactive and has a lot of publicly available data, which I think could be interesting for all of us. Maybe we can also share that in the follow-up. And lastly, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is a framework that does not focus on plastic disclosure specifically, but it looks at sustainability and the way companies engage along the ESG spectrum from a slightly more holistic point of view. And when it comes to the plastics focus, these data points are mainly used and usable for the material section of the GRI and the waste section of the GRI, where like different types of materials or like waste are reported. So I would love to just quickly hand it over to Stefan, who can share like a few additional insights on the national level or the kind of public view on measuring plastics or doing footprinting, because to summarize what we've seen before, like the focus was really strong on corporate plastic waste disclosures, as you've also seen the invitation of this session today. But to measure the corporate related, plastic use or the impacts of corporate related plastic use, there's obviously a really important need to connect the dots between the bottom-up measurement, which is performed by the corporates, and the top-down measurements, which is performed by the public sector and the nation states, to get an understanding of the bigger material flows. So yeah, we'd love to hand over to you, Stefan, to briefly walk the participants through your slide.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, hello everyone from my side as well. So we see here a list of 7 tools in the public sphere, which more or less calculate plastic leakage with different methods. We have tools which are on a global scale, working top-down with assumptions, and we have tools which work bottom-up, really on the ground, primary data, waste characterization, composition studies, observation walks, and so find different tools with different scopes here. That listing is based on 2020, so it's not the freshest, and some of the tools have kind of become another frame or culminated into a different kind of a consortia. And I would start just as a quick overview from bottom up, and the 7, so starting from bottom, is the waste flow diagram that's developed by University of Leeds, EAWAG, Westerwehr, and GIZ. And it does basically a leakage assessment on waste in the environment and in the waste management system. That is very, very closely harmonized with the main SDG method, the SDG 1161, developed by UN Habitat, which assesses basically waste generation and collection and treatment in appropriate facilities. Those 2 tools have been developed and applied in about 50 cases, and a lot of effort had been put in to make them interoperable. So data points are harmonized and the data can be shared between the 2 tools, but also among the portals which are just established. And that has been very beneficial in terms of ownership, but also in terms of usage and impact the tools generated. Because obviously tools create some evidence or some structured assessment with some suggestions and recommendations, and being handed as a part of a change process in a municipality. And here in understanding first how much waste is generated and how much of that is actually treated in controlled facilities, and then how much leaks into the environment and into the oceans, becomes a very strong point and for decision makers then to say, okay, we need to change that and we need to develop concrete measures to change that situation. The next tool, the fifth one, is the plastic pollution calculator, which follows a similar structured approach as the waste flow diagram, but has a far greater granularity in breaking into items and polymers, and also seasonable kind of differences and geolocated or geospatial information. Then the integrated plastic pollution quantification model has been transferred into SPOT. It's a global model now. It's also used on a highly aggregated level on a global scale to estimate waste generation and leakage into the environment. And then we have tools further up, which are, I think, still stand as the plastics drawdown from Common Thieves, which is also quite harmonized with method 6 and 7. And we have the second tool, which has been published under the Breaking the Wave by Pew in 2021, I believe, a major report developing scenarios and guiding actions on the national level. And we have the National Guidance for Marine Plastic Hotspotting in Action from developed by UN Habitat and IUCN. It's a global tool. It works top down with rather broad assumptions and also generates leakage rates for certain sectors, but also for the national picture. We are in contact, or the developers of the tools are in contact, exchange, and have also identified a further work plan to test the tools with standardized data sets to see how they compare and behave to each other. And this is all on the auspices of the UN UNEP Secretariat for the Plastic Treaty and the Committee of Practice, which is being set up and develops a work plan and a certain dynamic. That's in a nutshell. I hope this helps to give a bit of an overview. If you wish more information about that, I'm very happy to contact with you afterwards and give you more information. Back to
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Stefan. So yeah, I see that we're 35 minutes in. So yeah, try to kind of close our input within the next 5 minutes. So then we have about 20 questions, and I see that there's already a great question in the chat. Yeah, I suggest that we address all of this together in the in the discussion section. So yeah, I think one of the obvious question that you may ask, and a lot of people ask, is, okay, so what? Like, it's nice to know what these different frameworks are, but it would also be helpful to get some like insights and to understand, okay, what are the sort of opportunities, what are the limitations, and then also what are the recommendations that we can provide as the Prevent Waste Alliance and its members. And after kind of chatting internally with a lot of the members and trying to identify what the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats are, we summarized, let's say, the two major ones that popped up quite like often from the involved parties. And when it comes to kind of measuring and creating transparency on the note of corporate plastic use, one of the kind of strengths was that the transparency allows for internal and external progress reporting and kind of improvement, because what we've seen in a lot of organizations is that there are data silos and different players who don't necessarily talk to each other, making it really difficult for internal sustainability experts, for instance, to really get an understanding where the biggest potential is, and also how targets that are set are potentially achieved or not achieved over time. The second point that we identified as a strength of increased transparency through disclosures is that there is a potential to really kind of facilitate and create more trust within organizations and also in the processes internally that can potentially facilitate capital allocation. not only from the corporate side, but also the government side to potentially, incentivize or like subsidize certain behavior and rather like penalize other behavior. In terms of weakness, though, is that it has to be, acknowledged that disclosures are only like one part of the solution puzzle, because they don't actually move stuff on the ground. It's really to follow the idea that it's difficult to manage what you don't measure, and that's where disclosures come in. But after all, disclosures can only be effective when paired with effective action strategies that change things on the ground. And then another challenge or weakness is that the data is often quite limited within organizations, and there has, well, a lot of the organizations and decision makers are scared off from working on such transparency disclosures, even if they're internal, because there is quite a lot of work that has to be done internally to get all the data structures ready. In terms of the opportunities, I think that goes in hand with the strength that there will be an option to really fast track global plastic action, specifically with the upcoming plastic treaty that is negotiated in 2024 and most likely public.
There seems to be an echo, so kindly mute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. So exactly that, more information on the corporate side will also help policymakers to establish a treaty that is ambitious yet realistic from a private sector point of view. And then it is really possible to, kind of, as I mentioned before, to improve strategy development and capital allocation. Two important threats or like challenges that we've come across when talking to different actors is, of course, the reputational risk concerns when publishing some of the data externally. So that's one of the reasons why, for instance, the Global Commitments Progress Report dashboard that I mentioned before does not contain the nitty-gritty information of all the different signatories of the global commitment, because a few are, they're not fully convinced if they want to share some of the data externally for different reasons. And another argument that has come up is that like adding more specific niche metrics, like for instance, plastic waste specific metrics to a corporate sustainability reporting landscape will make the entire space more, let's say, confusing, because they're like specifically for companies who don't have plastic waste as the most one of the more material risk on their materiality matrix. These metrics could potentially take off attention from other metrics that are more important from a sort of like high level company assessment. And this is something that definitely doesn't make the life of many investors and the capital allocators easier when they get another, let's say, 15 or 20 metrics that are plastic waste specific, and then also have to analyze them in addition to all the other ESG metrics, which I think is a challenge, but a challenge that is kind of really worth addressing specifically to companies that have a serious business risk related to plastics and mismanaged plastics specifically. Cool. Yeah. So this is my last slide. Before we would, really love to have a conversation with you. The final recommendations and the conclusion is, let's say, rather high level, as you can imagine. But of course, we're now working and engaging with the sub-working group of the Prevent Waste Alliance on Plastic Accounting to potentially bring that to the next level. And we're also closely engaged with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the framework developers that you've seen on the slide here to make sure that we can potentially work towards this harmonization. On the journey to the harmonization or the like universally accepted framework, which would ideally be something similar to the greenhouse gas protocol for carbon, where it was really possible to establish this standard for corporates that generates a lot of trust and also harmonizes the different metrics. It would be great if we could learn and piggyback on the success stories that we've seen in the carbon and climate space. So that's one of the areas that we as members kind of agreed upon. That would be great to not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but really try to see what can be sort of like transferred over to the plastics and circular economy aspects. Second, and that's very much in harmonization with the plastic treaty that is discussed by the UN, is to consider a full life cycle of plastics, and that's mainly referring to the idea that it should not necessarily stop at the measurement of plastic waste that is disposed of at the company level, which is, for instance, what is often captured by the Global Reporting Initiative, but it should really look at the end-to-end processes and help companies to really understand and manage plastics that are coming from their suppliers all the way to the end consumer and the potential end of life. And lastly, I think that's also a shout to like a call for action, and thank you to all of you who are on the call today. That there cannot be enough collaboration between the different actors in the space. So I'm really grateful to have all of you on the call today. And yeah, thanks so much for your attention and interest in corporate plastic waste disclosures already. And would love to move to the discussion and yeah, see if you have any questions.